1,000 Kilometers to Leadership, the first in the trilogy of books, deals with life with the canvas of running as a backdrop. Specifically, the Comrades Marathon, which is an ultra marathon run between the cities of Pietermaritzburg and Durban, a distance of 90 kilometers over mountains. The idea for the book germinated as I finished this iconic race some 5 years back. For me, to be able to put that into paper, to put all my emotions, the training, and what I had learned in life was extremely important. And there was no other way for me to articulate the same except to put it in a book. For me, as I started exploring more about the book, I got to know that there was a fair amount of validation of my thought about leadership and marathon running. To the extent that S&P top 500 companies actually have a correlation of a higher market capitalization if the CEO is a marathon runner. This was contrary to what common thought process would be, but I intended to research it more, and eventually I did a TEDx talk on the same. As things began to evolve more and more, I found it more of a compulsion to put my thoughts into paper. But at the end, the book is not about running, the book is not about corporate life. The book is merely about life and how it evolves, whether in a personal sphere or in a corporate sphere, but with the backdrop of running. I hope you enjoy reading the book as much as I did writing it. Thanks.
Welcome back to Studio One. Oh my God, it has been a rather exciting first day of PILF 2020 so far. And for our last session today, we have Daniel Hahn in conversation with Booker Prize winner Jennifer Croft. We are very honored to have in our midst today Dr. Jennifer Croft, who is an American author, critic, and translator. She won the William Saroyan International Prize for writing for her memoir, Homesick, and the Man Booker International Prize for translation from Polish to Nobel laureate Olga Tokarczuk's Flights. Her other translations include Romina Paula's August, Federico Falco's A Perfect Cemetery, Pedro Meral's A Woman from Uruguay, and Olga Tokarczuk's Another Gem, A Book of Jacob. She holds a PhD in Comparative Literary Studies from the Northwestern University and an MFA in Literary Translation from the University of Iowa. We also have in our midst today Mr. Daniel Hahn, who is a writer, editor, translator with 70-something books to his name. His work has won him an Independent Foreign Fiction Award, the International Dublin Literacy Award, and the Blue Peter Book Award. And he has been shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize, among many others. He is a past chair of the Society of Authors and the UK Translators Association. Well, it is an honor to hand over this virtual mic to Daniel Hahn. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to this session. I'm delighted to be here today with Jennifer Croft, about whom you've heard a little bit of the bio and those lists of achievements and things. I should congratulate you on the Saroyan win, which was only like 3 days ago or something, wasn't it?
Yeah,
that's the newest thing. I should say that since I was asked to do this event, which was only about 3-4 weeks ago, since that time Jenny has won this big prize and also announced a new book that is coming, the Postcards book. So I'm slightly having trouble keeping up. It's lovely to be here pretending to be in India with you. Jenny is currently in Switzerland. I'm sorry we're not in Pune. I was at the Pune International Literature Festival a few years ago, and it was absolutely amazing. So this is the next best thing. So I'm glad we're both in this virtual PILF. We're going to talk, Jenny, I think, about translation and about writing, maybe about how they connect. There are all sorts of things to talk about. I wanted to start, I guess, with what I suppose is a sort of a biographical question about how you ended up in this peculiar line of work that we're both in. You grew up. I mean, this appears partly in Homesick, which I shall wave books in a visual aid sort of fashion. You talk about growing up in a sort of monolingual environment, and I've heard you in interviews talk about that kind of the process of acquiring languages, how you came to Russian, how you came to Polish and Spanish and so forth. But I'm curious to know about not about the process, but about the impulse. What is it that makes someone who begins with one language want to learn Russian, learn Polish, learn Spanish? What's the impulse that starts that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that we're talking about this because we have kind of opposite entry points. And my husband, Boris Streluk, also grew up speaking Russian and became a translator very, very young as a way of trying to reconcile his the culture into which he was born and the culture that he adopted at the age of 8 when he moved from Odessa to Los Angeles. So in my case, I think that I was always just really fascinated with language. I mean, not always, what does always mean, but when I started learning how to write, I became really fixated on writing all the time, and in an extremely misanthropic way as a child. And I also, my father was a professor of geography, so that contributed quite a bit. Although my family was monolingual, my dad was really interested in other places, and I guess, yeah, the learning languages aspect was my contribution to that interest. But it was there in my family, even if we didn't have the means to travel, but just seeing his atlases and globes and kind of fantasizing about a world outside of where I grew up, which I, at the time didn't like. Oklahoma is a very difficult place to live if you are a kind of more progressive person or a person who's really interested in certain forms of culture, such as literature. So there wasn't that much happening there then.
A friend of mine posted on social media a couple of days ago a sign that she saw outside the door of a classroom of a high school, I think it was a high school, in Bristol in the west of England. And the sign just said, monolingualism can be cured. And one of the things that is obviously interesting about that is that here in the UK, like in the US where you're based, there isn't much value, or there isn't enough value, or maybe there isn't the right kind of value given to the idea of languages being an asset and being a liberating thing. And so in a way, what you're describing feels particularly unusual, given precisely what you said about being in Oklahoma, being in a monolingual family.
Yeah, I would love for you to say more about the importance of speaking multiple languages, because I think in the United States, it really gets that everything that happens in the US has to be practical and useful. So why would you waste your time studying a language when everyone in the world speaks English is the general idea. And I would be so curious about your thoughts on that.
It's certainly the case here to a great extent. The UK, like the US, is actually a very multilingual country, but it's a multilingual country largely through heritage rather than through people who grow up monolingual, choosing to learn another language. There are lots of initiatives for celebrating people's home languages, heritage languages, community languages. There are lots of those things, including programs in schools, some of which are very good, but they are mostly for celebration rather than they're not normalizing exactly. Mm-hmm. There's a nice answer to the question, why should I have another language, though, in Flights, actually. Olga has that lovely piece about how terrible it must be to be just monolingual Anglophone, because, I mean, you'll remember this much better than me, but she said something like, because how do you not have your own secret language? If everyone speaks your language, how do you not have your own thing that other people don't understand?
Yeah, and I think, that's kind of tongue in cheek, and tongue is in the title of that passage. But actually I put that in Homesick as well. That was one of the things that I was looking for when I was studying Russian when I was a kid. I had always wanted a secret language with my sister that our parents couldn't understand. And even now I'm at this residency in Switzerland with 2 Polish writers, and whenever we want to complain about the food, we just do it, switch to Polish, and it's fantastic. No one has any idea that we're saying evil things right in front of them.
You can't complain about them, though, presumably.
Can't complain about them, no.
Spanish?
Yeah, but to whom would I be complaining? Someone has to understand the secret language.
Fair enough. Well, if you feel the need to complain about Polish writers secretly in Spanish, do let me know. I'm here.
Okay, I'll call you up.
Tell me how one gets from being, a kid who is interested in picking up languages for the reasons you talked about, learning Russian and learning Polish subsequently. How do you go from there to translating as a serious professional thing? You did an MFA in translation, I seem to remember. So this was Iowa?
Yes.
So what did you learn studying translation, or how did it make you better? I'm curious, as someone who I've taught translation much more than I've learned translation, which is possibly a worry. But I'm curious to know what you left that MFA with that you didn't have coming in.
Yeah, and I'm really curious because I know that education is such a significant component of your career. So I'm also really curious about your teaching philosophy and so forth. To be honest, the program at the University of Iowa, the Masters of Fine Arts in Literary Translation, is fantastic now, as you know. But when I was there, I started in 2001, and it was just in this very difficult period between when Daniel Weisford, who kind of ran it for a very long time, left, and when it ended up, kind of finding a new home. So while I was there, the program was confused, and it was only me and one other student named Karine Taktiris who were there, and we had to kind of just figure it out. We took the general idea was that we would take language courses, and we would take 1 translation workshop per semester and 1 translation theory course per semester. I was planning on continuing with Russian translation at that point, and shortly before classes began, there was some unpopular person was appointed as the chair of the Slavic department, and half of the department left abruptly in some kind of weird coup. So the only Slavic language that was left for me to study was Polish, which I didn't know anything about. But so the thing that Iowa taught me was Polish, which ended up being very significant for me. And it gave me time to work, to practice. But
well, practice is crucial. And I wonder whether one of the things that as translators, we all have different processes, and we all figure out our way of doing things, whatever happens to work for us. And I wonder if that came relatively quickly. Did you find your process sort of readily, or is that one of those things that just kind of book after book it evolves?
Yeah, I would say, well, that's a really good question. I know that when I started translating, when I was still an undergraduate student, I was so slavishly faithful. I was so paranoid about doing anything that would be even the slightest departure from the original text. And that's sort of the opposite of how I translate now. And I think, just doing some translations while I was at Iowa kind of allowed me to work through those fears, which is ultimately what they were, and kind of come to more of a sense of stability in my understanding of my relationship with an original text. But then having said that, every time I translate a book, it's different, even if it's the same author, which sometimes surprises me. But even within a short story collection, different short stories feel like totally new tasks to me that I have to gradually master. I don't know if that happens to you or if you find that it's more consistent.
It's interesting. I find it's mostly consistent for books. To a large extent, it depends on the scale. The books are largely the same. Shorter pieces are largely the same as each other. Picture books are a whole other thing entirely. But I work. I think, unlike you, I like to, launch myself into a book without having read it if I can, and I do these first drafts, which are incredibly quick and just unspeakably awful, but they are something, so I have 120,000 words which I can then wrestle with and kick around and scream at for a while, but at least I have something, and getting that something down is a really kind of is the tiresome bit that I need to allow myself to start having the fun. You read in advance, you prepare, you do everything that sounds much more competent than me, in fact, much more professional.
No, I mean, it somehow never occurred to me that you could do it the way that you're describing. And then recently, in the last couple of years, I've talked to so many people who do it that way, and it makes so much sense to me. And I received this residency in Switzerland to work on a novel of my own about translators, because even if I'm not translating, I'm still obsessed. And I have them all translate in that way. And I am now, just for fun, translating for this new Spanish language World Cup of Creative Writing, which is a project designed by a friend of mine in Argentina. And so for that, I am translating without having read anything beforehand, and I don't even know who writes. They just send me 10 short texts. And it's so much fun to translate that way. I mean, I have no idea the gender of the person. I just have to kind of go working it out as I get lower in the page. And it is really interesting just as a kind of self-analysis exercise as well, because I make so many assumptions based on the first paragraph, and then I always have to revisit the first paragraph because I was wrong about something really important. So I think I don't know. I'm sure I will end up doing this with a book. I don't know why I was so stuck on having read it beforehand, and I think partly it's because I was choosing authors to work with, but now I have some that I consistently work with, and I think it would be great. Why do you prefer to do it that way?
I like that process you describe of being aware of my reactions to something.
Yeah,
part of it is that very natural. I don't think you can ever quite replicate. However great the book is, the second reading is never going to be as exciting as the first reading. And there's something about that really particular electricity that happens when you discover a book for the first time. It also, in a completely practical and slightly lazy way, helps me to do that first draft, which I usually hate. Because actually what I'm doing is I'm working really fast in order to see where this voice is taking me, or who did it, or a lot of it is actually being propelled through the book in the way that a reader is, and making the same assumptions that a reader might be making, and falling for the little narrative red herrings that the reader is. And there's a sort of discovering that I love about it. And then there is the thing that is much more craft. Then there is the thing that is, not making a bad thing, but taking a bad thing and making it into a good thing, which is for me the more fun, the more sort of obviously fun bit. You said a moment ago, Jenny, something like when you were starting, you were trying not to depart at all from the original, which is now sort of the opposite of what you do. And it's obviously not actually the opposite of what you do, because this remains Olga's book in some way. It's not entirely another thing. But what did you mean when you said that now you're sort of doing the opposite of that?
I mean that I've come around to the idea that the real way to be faithful is to transform rather than to obsessively attempt to reproduce, which actually ends up losing the whole spirit of the original work. So, for example, with Flights, something I never would have done when I was younger is totally retitle the book. And I, in hindsight, I'm so glad that I chose the title Flights. I think it's really evocative in English, and I was able to incorporate it a number of times very organically into the book itself. So it has a lot of different meanings. And the original proposed title of Runners, which is a very strange title in Polish because it's not runners exactly. It's this recognizable root that means running, but that is the name of an Eastern Orthodox sect in the 18th century, and Polish people didn't know what it was when they saw that title. And I think, so trying to keep that meaning would have been, it wouldn't have been a mistake exactly, but I don't think that people would have picked up the book in the same way with this kind of curiosity that they ended up doing. So I guess I just believe in transformation a lot more now than in reproduction.
Is that partly to do with, there's obviously a kind of philosophical thing behind it, but is it also to do with confidence? Is it also to do with you saying, actually, I have some kind of agency here and I have my own ability to make choices? Is that also part of it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think, the fact that I wrote my first book, which is Homesick, at around the same time as I was translating Flights, is also a good indication of that. So I was kind of starting to feel readier to express myself or to allow my voice to be heard. And I think that's also something really interesting and good if a translator can sort of be fully present. I really love when I can choose a translator and then just follow them throughout their work, like you or like Damien Searles or Susan Bernofsky, and they translate the same writers sometimes and are so different, but I love what they both do, and I would just read anything by them. So I think it's good. Not that they are imposing the same style. You are imposing the same style on every author at all. That definitely isn't happening. But there's just something about that person that you can trust and that interests you and appeals to you. And I think that's really great.
That may also be partly. I asked the question I asked, I think I used the word confidence in making those choices. And it certainly feels to me with a lot of the translations I read that one of the things that I find really attractive is when you're like 2 sentences in and you think, this is going to be fine. This person, I was talking to someone recently about Julia Sanchez's translations of Sun on My Head and about Sophie Hughes' translation of Hurricane Season. And there are books like that which it takes about 7 seconds into the book, and you kind of go, this translator has grabbed hold of this book and is absolutely taking control of it. And there's something really attractive, I think, for a reader in just being able to trust them, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love also what Julia writes about that book and in general. And I love when translators also talk in public about their craft and their approach and so forth. And I find that also really helps me get into their actual translation work too.
When you were talking about following other translators and reading Damien or reading Susan, it made me wonder whether I'm sure there are many people who read whatever you translate, but it's quite hard to pin down what those things have in common other than the fact that you've translated them. You look at 3 or 4 different books and they have very different things going on. And I wonder if you can say something then about about the choices you make. Obviously there are some writers you become attached to and you stick with. But at the same time, I don't know how much you kind of pick out books and you are opportunistic and you see what comes along, how much you feel like, there is a project, which is to translate a certain kind of thing. How do those decisions happen for you, for the people who read one Jennifer Croft book after another?
All of the people. Yeah. The way that it used to work was that I would read a book and just fall in love with it, like really, feel like almost a chemical reaction to it, that I just had to work on it in some way. For example, even this Ukrainian writer, Natalka Sniadanko, that I worked with without having studied Ukrainian before, because I read her book, I read her novel in Polish translation, loved it, went to Ukraine to stalk her. I mean, she is also a Polish translator into Ukrainian, so I was able to track her down that way through common networks. And so we worked on translating her into English together. She didn't have much English at the time. I started studying Ukrainian for it. So in other words, like a real kind of devotion to someone or to someone's work. And that has mostly continued. I don't translate nearly as much as you do. I am always surprised by what ends up being easy for me to translate and what ends up being difficult. So sometimes the books that I really fall in love with are not the books that I immediately find I can get in harmony with as a translator. I have a book by Federico Farico called A Perfect Cemetery coming out very soon with Charcoal Press, and I keep tinkering with the little elements of the prose style in a way that I wasn't expecting. Whereas I have a book by Pedro Maidal coming out shortly after that I hadn't been working on for very long, and I had wanted to translate it for a long time, but the opportunity to do so came up very suddenly, and I translated it relatively quickly, and it just kind of flowed in a different way. So I think, they're not necessarily connected to each other, and they remain somewhat mysterious to me in the same way that I think, people's relationships with each other can remain somewhat mysterious. Like the people I have been in love with or dated, I don't know, they have no connection to each other. And of course, and I don't know why I was with some of them, but that's what happened.
I'll ask you. I want to ask you about the Federico Falco book actually in a moment, which I've just started reading it. But I'm curious about when you were talking about that some things come more easily and some things come with more difficulty, and it's hard to predict which. I've always had a theory that translators rather like difficulty. That there is something, if you're starting with a process that you know isn't going to be possible anyway, and you're going to have to do something quite radical to make it possible. I find myself much more often looking at a book going, this would be really difficult, let's have a go, rather than thinking this would be really easy, let's have a go. And I wonder whether there is also some appeal in there. I mean, I presume you didn't read Olga for the first time and think this would be really easy to translate. Is that struggle part of the pleasure, or do you still read it and go, why the hell did I agree to do this thing? It's so hard.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that at all before. I feel like so many other people do translations that I wouldn't do because I would feel just unequipped to do. For example, my husband Boris translates a lot of older works, and I feel like there's no way in hell that I can translate something from the 19th century because I'm already, not a native speaker of these languages, and then you add to that this century in which I have no experience, and I just can't. And he is so great at looking up, every single word in English and making sure that it was used in 1917, and this was how it was used. And he's so meticulous, and he also translates a lot of poetry with rhyme and meter, and these are things that are just like impossible for me. I mean, not impossible, but I just wouldn't do them because they're too difficult. So I don't know. I guess I never thought about when I fell in love with a book, I never thought about whether or not it would be difficult. is that really something, like when you are offered a project, are you thinking, I guess you have to, because you have to budget your time pretty carefully because you have so many things going on at once.
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, also because I don't always read them in advance, there's always a risk that it's going to be not what I expect. But there are certainly some kinds of things, and they're often quite intellectual things rather than other challenges in the book. There are some kind of things that I obviously complain about, but nonetheless think this would be such a fun challenge. So translating, if I know I'm going to translate something that has to be funny, or I'm translating something that I did a book this year, I co-translated a book in which the main character absolutely loves palindromes and anagrams, and the book is full of palindromes and anagrams. And on the one hand, of course, I think, what kind of idiot would agree to translate a book that is full of palindromes and anagrams? But there is a part of me to which I do not normally admit in public, which kind of goes, there's something about it's as I say, it's quite an intellectual and quite kind of bounded, quite concrete challenge. Partly because the feeling of success and something that hasn't come easily, obviously is very considerable.
Yeah. What about like a moral challenge? Have you translated an author where you just really didn't agree with any of their ideas? You don't have to name names, but I imagine, for example, I was obviously reading Sean Whiteside's translation of Serotonin by Michel Houellebecq, which I thought was fantastic, but that's an example of someone that could be really hard to do, potentially morally, knowing what we know about Michel Houellebecq.
I think it depends. I've never translated anything. I've never got halfway through a book and thought, I wish I hadn't started this. If only I'd known what this person was going to do to their characters, what this person was going to represent in the book. I've translated works of nonfiction which are full of things I disagree, but not things I disagree to the extent that I think this is a toxic argument that shouldn't be that has no place in the public square, right? And I'm happy to enable the voices of people I disagree, so long as I disagree with them within the bounds of what I think is respectful and decent, which obviously is an entirely subjective kind of measure. I'm sure there are things I could be asked to translate, and I would think, actually, I don't want to help this book reach more readers. I don't want to help this idea or this voice or whatever reach more readers. But I've not had that yet, which is fortunate, because, as I said, not because I don't always read things before I start. I make decisions based on various criteria, how much I want to translate the book, but they're always full of surprises. There is always a chance that either something I disapprove of in some deep moral way is going to happen, or indeed the book is just going to be really terrible in the second half. And again, I've so far been spared, because how the hell do you know? It's always slightly a risk.
Well, I think about it a lot in terms of our editors who agreed to publish something that they often, in the case of Polish, for instance, they are basing their decision off of a synopsis and a 10-page sample. So yeah, it's a big risk.
Yeah, it's worth being aware of how much we're asking a publisher. If you say, I'd like you to spend all this money and buy a book, commission a translation, spend all this money, at this point you will discover whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you, Jenny, about your writing, the non-translating writing as well, because we don't have very much time. We have 25 minutes left, but we're going to leave time for people to ask questions. So if people are watching and would like to ask Jenny questions, they can put them in the comments and we will come to them. But I want to talk about the writing and partly about how they're connected, the writing and the translating. Can I start with Serpientes y Escaleras? And if you could just briefly, for people who don't know, explain what that is and what the relationship of that to Homesick is.
Sure. So as I was kind of translating flights and writing my first book, I was living in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and I was feeling like part of the impetus to do this was that I felt this very strange gap between my personal life and my professional life. So I was living alone, and I spent my days alone working with Polish a lot of the time. And then I would go out in the evening with Argentine friends and have this completely parallel, non-intersecting existence. And I wanted to kind of find a way. I was doing other things to be a part of the literary community in Buenos Aires. I co-founded a bilingual literary journal, and I was at the time not really yet translating from Spanish, but I was sort of investigating that possibility. And I just woke up one morning and decided to start writing something that was inspired by my own life, but that would be a novel. And that was Serpientes y Escaleras. And I wrote it very quickly in Spanish. As I was writing it, though, I found that a lot of it has to do with my sister and my relationship with my sister. And in a way, it's kind of an ode to my sister, whose real name is Anne Marie and whose name in Homesick is Zoe. And I wanted to share what I was working on with her. And of course, she doesn't speak Spanish. So I started working on it, a parallel book in English too. And then that kind of took on a life of its own. And, I submitted the Spanish text to a ridiculously out of reach publisher, which was Penguin Random House Argentina. And they immediately accepted it. And at the same time, I was submitting the English to agents in the US and got an agent with the English version. The fact that I had an agent dissuaded Penguin Random House Argentina, although we had already been working on it for like 6 months at that point. And then I kind of was hoping that they would change their minds and was waiting around. And then I finally sent it to a press that I actually have always really loved, which is Entropia, which is, I think my favorite independent press in Argentina. And I've translated a couple of their authors now. And they accepted it as well. So it actually hasn't come out yet in Argentina. It's coming out in February, which is very exciting. The English version came out a little over a year ago, and it has all of these photographs, which are mine, in color and in black and white. And it became a little bit confusing, I think, to call it a novel when there were all of these pictures that were from my life. And the editor at Unnamed Press I was working with, Olivia Taylor Smith, suggested calling it a memoir. So they also diverge in that way. But I think, initially there was a huge difference between them because Serpientes y Escaleras is written in this extremely local and totally foreign style at once. So I think from the first sentence, there is this built-in intrigue because no one understands why it's being written in this way. So you have this person who's writing about tornadoes in Oklahoma in a weird syntax with very local vocabulary, because I only studied Spanish in Argentina and I don't know what's Argentine and what's not. I just have no other options. So obviously the English version didn't have that. And although I did try to be slightly playfully disruptive with syntax and things like that, but in a kind of inviting way, I ended up finding the solution to that through photographs. So choosing photographs that would undermine the text or challenge the text in some way rather than just being supports to the text. So that visual total transformation separates it pretty obviously from the Spanish original, if you want to call it that.
There's a line in it in Homesick in the English book. It's so hard for me to understand myself then, which makes me want to trace things back to where I started, which made me think about a number of things. But one of them is, of course, about how the writing process is a discovering process. It's not just an explaining things, it's about discovering things for yourself and about yourself. And I suppose maybe what you're talking about also in relation to the two books and the way they present differently to readers may also be about saying slightly different things about you as a writer and you as a more or less fictionalized character in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I never would have written that book in English. Like, that book had to come about in Spanish because of course, I have a different relationship with my identity when I am in a country that is not my native country that I've chosen because I love it. And, constructed a life there from scratch. That's a totally different thing. And then it allows me to absolutely, as you say, kind of come to this totally new understanding of parts of my life that I never gave a second thought. I mean, I never thought about Tulsa, Oklahoma at all in any serious way until I started writing Serpientes y Escaleras. So definitely a process of discovery for me.
Am I right in thinking you haven't translated to Spanish, or you don't regularly translate to Spanish despite having a writer's Spanish as well? Is that something to do with just the different demands on a language and the different relationships to a language?
Yeah, well, I mean, as of right now, I wouldn't translate into Spanish because I don't have those nuances that I frequently rely on when I'm translating into English. So, I mean, there are some people who do this so wonderfully. It can move back and forth between languages, and I don't have that dexterity. I don't have that nuance.
I mean, I think the very idea of translating out of English into another language is baffling to me. But then again, I haven't written a novel in Spanish, so that's already an entirely separate territory of what feels plausible somehow.
Well, but what I did was make my deficiencies into part of the plot. My deficiencies or my strangeness, let's say. So the fact that I don't talk like an Argentine, but I use these things that they recognize as their own is part of the plot. Like, spoiler alert, the character in Serpientes y Escaleras comes from Oklahoma and goes to Argentina and is foreign and that's who she is. So I can't impose that strangeness onto whoever I would want to be translating, who wouldn't have that as an element of her book.
Presumably, you could find just the right book for that. You could find the book for which that would be just the right Spanish. And if you read the first, like, I'm thinking of something like the first Shell Gros book in her first English book,
Mm-hmm.
English Dictionary for Lovers. It kind of feels like it is the English book which would live in exactly that kind of Spanish. I want to say something about that. We talk often in quite abstract ways. I think about the connection between writing translations and writing other kinds of things and how they relate to each other. But there's a particular thing actually that comes from what we were talking about a moment ago, this discovering process. When I was teaching a summer school class in translation earlier this year, one of the translators in the group translates from Welsh, among other things, and we talked about this word hiraeth, which is this kind of longing for home word, which some other countries have, some other languages have. And we talked quite a lot about how translation is connected to that, essentially homesickness is translated, it's connected to this reaching for something. It's not just, it's sort of impossible to disconnect from your relationship to those things. And it seems to me that's quite an interesting way in which your writing and your translating are sort of speaking to each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, one thing that I discovered as I was doing this homesick project and thinking about it in a lot of different languages is that, of course, like, there is no such thing as returning home, because always, like, I went back to Oklahoma from Argentina at some point to visit my sister, and of course everything is different from how I remembered it, and I'm different, and on and on and on. So, and language also isn't a one-to-one match in any case. Like, there's no example of something that kind of fits perfectly the thing that it refers to. And so I think the closest I can feel to a homeness or an authenticity perhaps is in the movement between the languages and in kind of that space that is a little bit underneath words. And so, yeah, I think I can't imagine doing my own writing without writing translations, and I can't imagine writing translations without also having, all of these other ideas that I want to incorporate into a different text. I think they're so mutually enhancing, and I really wish that more writers would translate. I think that would be so helpful. I don't know if you have thought about introducing, or maybe you have done this, taking writers and kind of forcing them to incorporate translation practice into their writing workshops.
Well, there have been some interesting examples of that, and there are both writers who run workshops and translation is kind of brought in, and also vice versa, but also projects like, I'm thinking about things like the Adam Thirlwell Multiples project, in which he got, I think, 60 people translating, but they're all people who are principally novelists or principally known as novelists. On the whole, the Anglophone ones had never translated before. Everyone else had already translated anyway, because it's, as you will know, half of the Argentine novel writing community, they also translate things, because why wouldn't you do a translation of Faulkner if you had the chance? But it was an interesting, the thing which Adam did was an interesting project where basically he got people who are used to writing novels forced to write translations in order to see basically whether they could somehow contain their natural instinct to style, to their own, whether they could hide their own fingerprints, as it were, which does not always work. It's not always a success when they do. But I'm interested when you were talking about the ways in which those two things, not being able to, translate without writing or write without translating, and being aware of kind of what's happening underneath. It did make me wonder whether not only your translating affects your writing, but whether it affects your reading, and whether it's possible. I mean, for those of you watching, Jenny judged the International Booker this past year, which means reading, 100 and whatever it was, translated novels. And I wonder whether you read as a translator then, whether you can help having that part of you, having that kind of awareness of, a slippage between what the words are trying to do and what the words might be, what the effect might be having.
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm always thinking about language rather when I'm reading anything, whether it's originally written in English or not, and kind of analyzing the author and I mean, not necessarily consciously, but yeah, I'm not sure if I'm thinking as a translator I guess I wonder if for you, if you read a translation from Spanish or Portuguese, for instance, are you kind of looking for the original underneath as you read the English?
I always hope not to be. I mean, I always hope there are certain things, because the languages I have, so Portuguese, Spanish, and French are languages I translate from. But I know a little bit about other languages to be able to recognize sometimes where the bones might be showing through. And you can always tell, there are those telltale things of, where a character in English will say, good morning, how are you, sir? And the other person will say, you needn't call me sir. And you know that this is a really clumsy way of dealing with the fact that in English we don't differentiate between formal. There are certain things like that which remind me that there is something not very artful going on. And I try not to, but like you, I am aware of writing when I'm reading, which isn't always a good thing. But I think at least part of that is to do with being a translator and having those habits of reading as a translator. Oh.
What happened? I'm so sorry.
You disappeared for just a second. Welcome back. Hello. We have, I think it's time for us to go to questions. We have a little note. So I'm going to see if there are questions that will show up on the screen. I will put them to you. Otherwise, I'm going to keep asking you things because I have loads of things I still want to talk to you about. So I wanted the whole question: what is going on in the field of English literature? I don't know whether the ... means that there is more to this question, or whether this is an enormously big and general question.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm trying to click in the comments, but I don't think that there is more written there. What is going on in the field of English literature?
Yeah, no, that is the whole question. It's a nice, difficult one. Do you feel? I mean, are you able to keep up with things that are written in English? Are you able to are you able to read as widely as you would like in Anglophone writing, as well as in the writing of the languages you're working from?
Yeah, I do read a fair amount. I've always read a lot of contemporary American literature. I have to admit that I don't read as much from the UK. I think, I don't know why that is, but I really like reading contemporary American literature, and I think it also kind of makes me a better translator to stay abreast of how the kids are talking these days.
Well, it's that's one of the tools of the trade, isn't it? You need to be able to work with that language.
Yeah, and it's, of course, at some point it becomes impossible to keep up with everything, especially if you're translating from multiple languages. I mean, I've long since given up on keeping up with every new thing that's published in Poland and every new thing that's published in Argentina and every new thing in the US. But I think there are great things happening in American literature right now, if that answers the question.
Good, that's a good answer. That's a positive answer. The next question is, what really attracts you to translating someone else's work as against writing your own originals?
Well, I think there are a number of different things. I mean, there's this kind of sense of mission that while English language literature has so much happening and can be so diverse and so wonderful, there are also a lot of things missing. We don't have as many translated books as people in other languages often do, and it can be, really helpful antidote to a certain kind of isolationism, which unfortunately both of our countries suffer from. So there's that, and then also it's nice sometimes to be on your own, and it's nice sometimes to be in a relationship. So I think, it's wonderful. I love working with people. I love collaborating, and my main form of collaboration is translation.
Can I ask something I'll ask another orange question in a moment, but that idea of collaborating, one of the things that we know, I think, is that the job of the translator is partly translating, but also you are agenting and scouting and promoting, and you're doing a festival event now, and all kinds of things that you have to do that are sort of part of the job that are much less to do with sitting quietly on your own with a text. There was recently the LARB published a conversation between you and other translators of Olga's work, and I wonder if you can just say something about that. I guess about the sort of community you get from doing this sort of job, because it's much less sort of lonely and isolating, it seems to me, than people would assume.
Yeah, I mean, the translation community feels so different from the writing community. There's such a different attitude because from the outset it is collaborative, and I feel like the translators I know are just so much more curious about each other's work and so supportive. I mean, there's so many translators who are advocates for emerging translators, and people like you who are so supportive. And I think that is just a really incredible aspect of our field. And then there are certain writers around whom translators gather, like Olga Tokarczuk, and that is also a really wonderful mini community within the community to have.
Thank you. There's a question. How did you feel on receiving the Booker Prize for translation?
Great. at first, and then a little bit overwhelmed because there was a lot of publicity involved. And I think that is how Olga felt too. So we were it was nice that we were kind of thrown in together. And yeah, I mean, it was obviously really wonderful for both of our careers. And Flights was her, I think, 11th book or something like that. And Antonia Lloyd-Jones had been doing such a wonderful job of translating her, and I had been translating her for quite a while, just short stories and excerpts. And she just hadn't quite broken through. And it was when she won the Booker that people started to really pay attention to her. And suddenly she was, obviously a brilliant writer, which she always had been, but it was very helpful.
How did it make it? You said it made a difference for both of your careers. How did it make a difference to yours? Is it a practical thing, like there is more work or different work or better paid work or higher profile work? What actually? No, none of it. It's all still
No, I actually thought that there would be more of a difference, but with, I'm not going to say what it is, but the book that I was working on right after that, I believed in it so much, and I actually, it's the only time I've ever translated the whole book without having a publisher yet. And I was so excited about it, and I went to publisher after publisher after publisher, and exactly the same thing happened to me that happened with Flights. People just kept saying, like, yeah, but who is this person, and why is this slow, and what is the point of this? And I got rejection after rejection after rejection after rejection. So it didn't help in a practical sense. I think it might have more to do with what you were asking about earlier in terms of confidence and just being forced to do all of that publicity. And then, we did a big book tour in the US for Flights shortly after we won the prize. And I happened to live in New York for a year during that year and was doing just a ton of events. And I didn't really like appearing on stage, but it was really good and important training, and I think it made a difference.
Thank you. I have one last audience question we have time for. Which language do you prefer to translate? Do you have is there a pecking order? Do you prefer one to another, or are they just different relations?
I thought that I preferred Polish, but I think now that I was just more accustomed to translating Polish, I think I had like my little systems that I used in, subconscious systems in place. And so certain things were quicker, and now I'm building those up in Spanish. So yeah, I don't know. I can't choose between my two children. Do you have a preferred Portuguese or Spanish?
I like different languages for different kinds of books. Because I translate quite a lot from French now, but mostly picture books, and I love that form. But I also, unlike you, because I translate Portuguese, Spanish, and French from lots of different countries. I don't focus on actually knowing something about the country, which means that often that's where the variety is. It's not between language A and language B. It's between language B1, B2, and B3, because I'm translating from Guatemala or from Chile or from Spain or whatever. We're just about out of time, Jenny. Can I just ask you very quickly a last thing before we have to stop, about the things that are coming next? You mentioned the Falco book, Perfect Symmetry, which is coming from Charco Press, I think, in April. Mm-hmm. I have started reading, and it's brilliant so far. And I'm sorry, we can talk more about it. And then the big thing, which is pending, is Books of Jacob, which is Olga's like 1,000 pages, something like that.
Yeah, it's a little bit more than a Word document, but I'm not sure exactly how they're gonna design it. So we'll see how many. It'll be some pages. Yes.
Well, I have read about like 10 pages of your translation, and I'm very excited for the other 1,000 and whatever it is. I'm afraid we are, I think, going to have to stop. It is now. I've completely lost track of which time zone we're supposed to be in, but it's now exactly 60 minutes after whatever time it was we started. I'm very grateful to PILF for arranging this event, and to Jennifer Croft for talking to me. It's lovely to see you, Jenny.
Lovely to see you, Danny. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you so much for such a captivating conversation. It has surely motivated our readers and, just to pick up a book and do more than just writing this time. So thank you so much for all the time you have taken out of your busy schedules. Also, I would like to take this moment to thank our sponsors, our international sponsors. That is Alliance Francaise, Salzburg Global Seminar, Embassy of Portugal, Goethe Institute, Max Muller Bhavan, Institut Français, India, Literature Across Frontiers, Literary Europe Live, Creative Europe, Program of the European Union, and our participating publishers, Bloomsbury, Readomania, HarperCollins, Westland, and Speaking Tiger. Well, it was the first day of PILF, and what a day it was. We had some very interesting sessions, and I cannot wait for the next 2 days. So thank you so much for being with us on this online journey. We hope you enjoyed being a part of the same. On this note, we end day 1 of PILF 2020, and we hope you had as smashing time listening to all the speakers as we had conducting this session for you. And will join us tomorrow, for we have a whole new set of interesting sessions lined up. Thank you and good night. Bonne nuit, Shabakher.